Welcome to the Aussie Firebug Podcast, the financial independence podcast for Australians. Hi guys, welcome to another episode of the Aussie Firebug Podcast, the financial independence podcast for Australians, where I interview clever people who have already reached or on their way to financial independence. Our guest today is Serina Huang, or better known as Miss Frugal Ears. Serina works as a public servant, but is also a writer, blogger and foodie. A self-proclaimed frugalista, Serina lives with her two sons in Canberra and has appeared in such publications as the RIOT ACT and the Canberra Times. She's currently writing a book about becoming a frugal multimillionaire and one day hopes to be a billionaire. Welcome to the show, Miss Frugal Ears.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to have an opportunity to speak with you.
Now, first question I have to ask, what's a frugalista?
Yeah, good question. Some people have probably heard about a fashionista, and a fashionista is someone who has very good fashionable taste on a budget. Well, a frugalist is the same. It's someone who wants to live an amazing life, doesn't want to feel deprived, but still wants to live quite simply and with their means. And I think once you take that concept, you can really learn to appreciate some amazing things without having to spend a lot of money.
And did you come up with this term, or did you read it somewhere?
I don't think I specifically coined it as being original, but now that you think of it, I haven't really seen it used a lot, no.
I definitely haven't seen it. I was, when I seen it on your site, I was, that's the first time I've seen that. It makes a lot of sense. I sort of thought, it was something to do with, being frugal, being Miss Frugal Ears and, fashionista. But yeah, very, very clever term. Well done for coining that if you did. Whereabouts in Australia are you from?
So I currently live in Canberra. So I've been here since 2000, other than 3.5 years spent on posting in Taiwan. This is now my home.
Ah, fantastic. And have you always lived in Canberra?
No, I was born in Melbourne. I grew up in Noosa Heads, and I did most of my high schooling and university in Brisbane.
Wow, that is a bit of travel, especially I am outside of Melbourne, but we're currently in not the middle of winter, but I know how miserable and cold Melbourne can be. So moving to Noosa Heads would have been quite a nice change of scenery, I'm sure.
Yeah, it was. Although I was a little bit of a bookworm, so I always struggled not being close to a library. When we lived there in the early 80s, there wasn't a lot of infrastructure there. So it was quite different. And I do actually quite like the cold of Canberra. Mind you, it was snowing a little bit today and sleeting. It's going to be good snow in the ranges.
It's very good snow season.
It is a very good snow season. And I took up cycling to work just as winter hit this year. So minus 4 degrees, and I'm still out there on my bike most days.
That is dedication. Have you always been frugal?
Yes, in my own way.
Where do you think that comes from?
Yeah, good question. Probably my upbringing. I think my parents were frugal on both sides, but in different ways. My mum's a fashion designer, and you would think with that would go a huge propensity to spend money on luxury handbags and luxury designer brands. We certainly always lived in very big houses, the sorts of houses that sometimes it was a bit embarrassing to bring left-wing uni friends over to visit you. I tended to keep a little bit quiet sometimes about where I lived because they were always very big, impressive places. But actually beneath that, the average weekly budget spend or the clothes spend was actually quite small. So Mum always had an amazing sense of style, and she just knew how to coordinate her articles and of clothing of what she wore. So often it might be a simple black T-shirt, but with, an amazing scarf and amazing accessories, and the whole thing would not cost a lot of money. And on our shopping trips too, we didn't tend to spend a lot of money. We'd go to more budget supermarkets. So it was always this, I guess, kind of living the high life, or appearing to live the high life at least, but actually not spending a lot underneath. And my dad too, he was a public servant. My parents are divorced, so they live very different lives. But I think there's a strong history in his family of strong community service and strong values of valuing people and giving generously to certain things, but not necessarily living in an ostentatious way themselves. So I think on both sides there's been a bit of a history, but in different ways.
Yeah, it's usually from my experience, talking to people about, you know, where they either learned the value of the dollar or investing or being frugal is usually in the home or some experience that they've had, good or bad, from their upbringing that usually, dictates that. So you were you lived a relatively, middle to upper class lifestyle as growing up with your parents. They had, great jobs, it sounds like. But they still...
yes, my mum was a very successful entrepreneur. So, she did very well. And, I went to a fairly exclusive private school in Brisbane. But she had a very strong work ethic. See, she was very big about not giving us money. So if we wanted money, we had to work for it. She'd say, well, come into my factory and you can do some work and then you can earn some money. And, she didn't really cut me any slack. I had to work if I wanted money. So I always had part-time jobs either with her or then later as a checkout chick and a law clerk and doing other things to earn money. And that came from her upbringing too, because she left school when she was 14 because she knew she wanted to be a fashion designer and my grandfather wouldn't educate her. He said, you're just a Sheila and that's a waste of money. And so she always had this strong work ethic that she got from that, and she didn't get handouts. And she was also very determined that she'd seen a lot of what she termed, I guess, spoilt rich kids who were given handouts, and she didn't want my sister and I to grow up like that. So that was kind of a bit strange because growing up, particularly at university, people assumed that we had a lot of handouts, that we had golden spoons, that we had a lot of money, but actually we didn't. We probably had less than most people would be given from their mother or father. And sometimes that was a little bit difficult to reconcile.
And did you ever...
but I think...
Sorry, go on.
But I think in the end of the day that kind of worked in terms of instilling a strong work ethic and a strong savings history. So it was good.
I was just about to ask that, some people resent their parents, when they're in that position where they're young and they know their parents have got money, but they won't, give them money for a trip or for a new car or whatever it is, but they learn later in life that actually the lessons that they learnt were far greater than the gifts that they could have gotten at that moment in their life. So sounds to me like you fall in that category with your parents as well, which is nice to hear.
Yes.
So why don't we just talk a little bit about Miss Frugal Ears and how that come about?
Lovely. So the name was fairly serendipitous, actually. So my first blogging attempt was actually when I lived in Taiwan, and I used to blog about foods and restaurants and places that I liked to go to. And at the time, being an expat Australian living in Taiwan, it was actually fairly cheap to go out, and I would often go out with my work. So it wasn't necessarily a frugal kind of view. It was more of a cross-cultural view. But then when I came back to Australia in 2014, my financial situation changed quite a lot because I was no longer on the expat salary. I was back in the suburbs of Canberra. And my ex-husband and I, at that time, we had 10 properties between us.
Whoa.
Which sounds fairly impressive.
Yeah.
But in 2014 also there was a massive reduction in the Commonwealth Public Service particularly, which affected Canberra's rental market. So there was a severe downturn in rental incomes. And in fact we had a 6-month gap in a vacancy in one of our rental properties. And a lot of them went down by about 20% in rent. So it was actually quite a difficult time coming back to Australia, no longer being on the same kind of generous salary, and then also taking a hit with these investment properties, not really being able to sell them necessarily, even if we wanted to, because the market conditions weren't right. So things were pretty tense. And then 6 months later, I separated from my husband. And so then suddenly I had that kind of burden of paying for those, plus childcare fees, which in Australia, the childcare fees in Canberra are more expensive than anywhere else in Australia. Before rebates, they're $100 a day, and I had 2 children in childcare. So plus everything else. So things kind of got quite difficult quite quickly. And I knew I was always frugal, and I knew I could find a way through that. So I just kind of delved into my inner frugality for those first few months at least, while things were pretty tight. And I tried not to think about, the future of, what if I ran out of money, or what if I couldn't pay the mortgage, or what if there was a major medical problem. I just kind of at that stage just decided to just focus on the day-to-day. So my philosophy was one day at a time, one thing at a time. And that's kind of what I focused on. And then probably as I was sort of getting out of that a bit, I realized that I wanted to get my writing mojo back, and it no longer felt right for me to be writing about Taiwan. So my ex-husband's Taiwanese, because that no longer really reflected what my identity was anymore. And while I love Taiwanese culture, and I always will, it didn't feel authentic for me to be writing about that in the same way anymore. And so then I thought about it a little bit more and thought about, well, what are my values and what is authentic for me and what is my life? And I realized that, I'd always been frugal, and I was especially frugal now. And I felt there was a message in there about the importance of that when you have financial empowerment, you can make important choices to do the things that are important for you. And in my case, it was getting out of a bad relationship and feeling a lot more liberated and empowered by that. And it occurred to me that I was in a good situation because I had a good job, I had investments, I was good with money, so I could do that. Now, I was scared, but I could do that. There's a lot of women who don't have those sorts of choices, and society may or may not blame them for staying in bad relationships, but really at the time they may not have that many choices. So that's always kind of been a sort of subliminal backstory that I don't always necessarily bring to the front, because it's really more of a lesson, I guess, a message about living a very fulfilling and happy and positive life. But I'm definitely always very conscious that sometimes not everyone has lots of money and they have to do without. And so how do you make that so that it becomes a challenge and something that's fun and something that's rewarding, rather than something that's all about deprivation and misery?
Absolutely. So much to unpack in that. You wrote a very moving piece called Money and Divorce, which I can link to in the show notes. And you talk about how important it is for women to have their finances sorted, and especially with yourself going through a divorce. Can you just touch on that a little bit more? You mentioned it a little bit before, but how important it is for you. And I know you've got two sons, but let's imagine that you had a daughter, that the values that you would instill into her about having those finances sorted for all different reasons, but especially I feel as though majority of the times in society it's looked to be the man to handle those finances, and the woman in the case of a divorce sometimes doesn't know where to turn.
Yeah, look, that's really interesting. I mean, I think things are changing a lot. I think the family court still has this kind of vision of the man as the breadwinner and the woman as a stay-at-home mum, and that's not always the case. In my case, I was the main income earner, so I actually had to give my ex quite a lot of money during the divorce settlement, and that's just how that is. So I guess that's kind of one thing that I would say. It's interesting you've picked on this article, because when I wrote it, I actually didn't really think too much about it. It was kind of one of these things that I just kind of went, oh, well, it was my experience. Maybe there's something in it that might help other people. And it was actually another friend who herself is also single who actually contacted me and said, wow, Serina, you're so courageous. And I went, for what? It just sort of just didn't even kind of I didn't even think about it. But, now that she's mentioned it, now that you've mentioned it, it seems somehow still that divorce is taboo. That sort of people can sort of understand now that people get divorced, and, they might somehow think that, maybe it's somehow on some level their fault because, they're not managing a relationship perfectly or whatever. But the money side of it that goes with that is rarely talked about, and that is really, really important because there's a lot of things to go with that. For instance, one of the first things that, it is really hard is that so many things are so intertwined. I mean, when I broke up with my ex, we'd been together for 17 years. We had 10 investment properties together. We had other shares and other investments together. I mean, that's nearly all been wound back now, but, that doesn't happen overnight. And so, it might be tempting to say, oh, well, I'll never speak to this person again. But the reality is you've got bills to pay. And so you've got to have measures in place to do that. So one of the first things I did was actually put into place on our bank accounts that we would both require joint signatories, which is a fairly dramatic thing to do, but it's also very important because, especially in that initial time when you're separating, there can often be some problems with a lack of trust. And you don't want someone to go into your bank account and suddenly withdraw $100,000 and go off to Rio and you never see them again. And I'm not saying it would have happened with my ex, but, things are really fraught, and, you just want to make sure that both sides are going to do the same thing.
Absolutely.
So, and in fact, at the time, and actually I still am banking with IMB, and they're one of the few banks that will do that electronically. So still when we pay for joint things with my ex and I, they'll send an authorization to my ex if I pay it first, or put it through the system first, then send it to him, so that both of us, electronically agree to something before it goes through. So I guess that's one of the first things. The second thing is sometimes the initial focus is very much on custody of the children, which is, don't get me wrong, it's important. But the property settlement stuff can often lag and delay. And so often it can be, 12 months, maybe even 2 years before you've got things sorted. So I'm 3 years out now, and there's still 2 properties that we're just resolving now. And so what that means is you've got this immediate need for money, but your assets are tied up in these joint sort of situations, and you sort of can't get them at them for a while. And it's really important to still have those investments. You don't want to sell them at a bargain basement price just to get rid of them. But by the same token, you have immediate things. You've got, legal fees, you've got childcare fees, you've got groceries to pay for, you've got quite a lot of things that are happening. So that, is one thing that's quite difficult. And the other thing too is it's often unclear exactly at what point of time after you separate finances become single or they become joint. So for a while, for instance, I was really quite scared to put a lot of money into my bank account because, I might have been saving and saving and saving, and he might have been spending and spending and spending. And then, suddenly the court says, well, you didn't agree till 12 months after divorce. So, everything's 50-50 or 60-40 or whatever. So for a while I was actually keeping cash at home. I know that sounds really weird. It sounds like kind of, storing things, and I was never comfortable with that because it's a really bad investment strategy when you look at it in the scheme of things. But in those first couple of months where you're just not sure about things, sometimes that's, the only option you've got is just to keep physical cash on you because you know that it's actually yours. So yeah, there's a lot of things. In fact, we could probably talk just a whole podcast about, managing, divorces, finances after divorce, but I guess one of the key things is to reestablish that trust as quickly as possible because, you can fight and you can fight and you can fight over what might be right, but at $500 plus an hour on legal fees, you've got to ask yourself, is it really worth it? So you have to take a very pragmatic approach and to try wherever possible to come to an agreement that's mutually workable. And then just to walk away from the rest, and then to trust that when you're in a happy place, again, that you can channel abundance and to have faith that that will happen. So it's very much a forward-looking strategy that rather than looking back about what I've lost, rather what you're gaining.
Absolutely. And, I think this is such valuable information for anyone going through something like this in their life, especially after a breakup or a divorce, to have, to know what to do next time and to, have perspective for someone that's gone through it like yourself. And I think it's great as well. Like you said, $500 an hour for legal fees, and you don't want to sell at a loss. I think that's a really important thing to note. I always tell people, if the cash flow is strong, especially I invest in property. I've got 3 property myself, and I also invest in the share market. But with the property, I always tell people the lifeblood is the cash flow of the property. Because if you've got great cash flow, they keep talking about this, bubble in Australia, and every newspaper you read, is predicting when the bubble's going to burst and everything like that. And even if it does burst, unless my rent drops by 2/3, my strong cash flow position will keep me through until the recovery phase, and eventually, hopefully, it goes back up in price. So why would I sell if it burst? Why would I sell at a loss unless I'm forced to? Now I understand there's some people that maybe max out their borrowing capacity, and a few percent interest rate rises could ruin them, and that's a bit different situation. But I think it's really cool that you and your ex-husband were smart enough to know, okay, you know, we're finished our relationship together, but it doesn't mean that we have to financially, you know, ruin ourselves or sell at a loss and lose, you know, tens of thousands, I don't know, but, you know, heaps of money, and you can work it out and slowly, like, sell off when the time's right and everything like that. So kudos to you for being as adults.
It's not an easy one, and I guess, you know, I'm sort of in a slightly different phase to most people because I'm sort of in a consolidation phase, you know, and I did sort of think earlier on, would it be best just to keep those properties because, you know, in a sense it does make sense, but, you know, I guess both of us had a desire that we just wanted to separate things out and go our separate ways with that as much as possible because, you know, even though you've got a property manager, you still have to communicate over those properties and you've got to make joint decisions about them. And when you're not in a happy place together, it's harder to do those. For instance, one of our properties we bought with the intention of developing. Actually, two of them we did. The one in particular was halfway through a subdivision. And, you know, for a while I thought, well, maybe we just hold on to that together and we continue with the subdivision and maybe we develop it. But then I was kind of like, oh, hang on, that's pretty stressful. You're going through a divorce with someone and then you're going to be like building a property with them. Like, you know, even for a normal person building a property is kind of pretty stressful. So, you know, I think, you know, the pragmatic thing there was he wanted to buy me out on that one. So I went, look, okay, even though perhaps I might make more money in the long run, you know, it's probably, you know, not worth my negative energy. So I think we've been very blessed that we've been able to talk together about how deal this. It's not perfect. Nothing is perfect, but, you know, we certainly haven't made crazy decisions because we've decided to fling mud at each other and hate each other. So
yeah, and I think that's the most important thing. Like you said, you got to strike a fine balance. Like you don't, you know, I tend to agree. It would be pretty hard to go through that with someone that you've just, you know, been through a divorce with, but at least you guys, you know, were on the talking terms and you could settle it, you know, without too many losses and, you know, slinging the mud and everything like that. So you know, it could have been worse, I guess.
Exactly. So
now, this is the Financial Independence podcast.
Yes.
Was financial independence a goal of yours and your ex-husband's when you started, or were you investing before you met him, or did you sort of go on that path together?
Well, we met when we were at university and neither of us had much money. So, you know, he'd just immigrated to Australia from Taiwan and I was finishing up my studies and, you know, had pretty much was depleting my savings just because I was at the end of that. So, no, but when you talk about financial independence, do you mean like, you know, retire by the age 40 kind of financial independence?
We'll just say it's just having enough money to choose what you want to be able to do in life. Not necessarily retiring to just, you know, play bowls and read books all day, but just having that financial security. Let's just call it that for your investments. You know, to generate that passive income. Was that did you start investing with that goal in mind, or?
Yes and no, and I think that was one of the issues in our marriage that we disagreed with this. So. My philosophy had always been that I wanted to own my own home and I wanted to own my own home outright. And actually I eventually did with my last property, which I have just sold and now I've moved in a city. So I now have a mortgage again, but it's given me a different lifestyle. But that was always very important to me to have that sense of home ownership, for various reasons. I think it's just a security thing. And also too, because, I mean, I work in government and you would think that that would be an incredibly secure job. You know, I guess to the outside, public service always is. But you're very much at the whim of public policy. And I've seen people who suddenly find that, you know, there's a new government come in, there's a new government policy. It might be something that they are very strongly opposed to on a moral ground. For instance, like, you know, an immigration issue or a defence issue. But because they have so many debts or they've got, you know, expensive private school for their kids, they've got a big mortgage, they stay in these jobs that they really hate, that they feel morally opposed to because they have no choice. Now, I have always wanted to be in a position that I don't have to do a job that goes against my values because of the money. So I want to set myself up so that if something did happen, if there was, you know, crazy, I don't know, Trump-style government in Australia, touch wood, the weird right-wing things happening throughout the world right now. They came in and said, right, we want you to go and build a, wall somewhere and keep the New Zealanders out or whatever. And I sort of felt that was wrong. That I could
we're
say,
lucky because we don't have any, we don't border any countries directly. So I think,
touch wood.
appalling style Prime Minister.
But anyway, something that I was morally opposed to. I mean, this is just, a random example that I could say, well, look, check here, here's my resignation and it'd be fine.
Sure.
That said, I do have some reservations about the whole financial independent retire early movement in a sense, because I guess I felt in my marriage that we were so focused on building up a big portfolio that we weren't actually living in the now. And that just meant we never sort of really went on holidays. We never really went out to restaurants. We never really kind of did a lot of, went to shows. I mean, we did to a few, but not a lot because we were really so overstretched, that it was always a bit of a struggle. Now, it was okay for 5 years. Like 5 years, I didn't mind doing it because I could see that we were growing properties. But after 5 years, I sort of asked, well, why are we doing this? Like, so what? Like, what are we going to wait till we're 80 and then we retire and then, you'll travel the world? You're not fit enough to do much at that stage. In fact, last year I took up skiing again, which I'd had a gap of 25 years in doing. And there's no way known I could have done that previously because it's, it's a fairly expensive sport. But I went with my 74-year-old dad and I went with my kids and it just was the most amazing, exhilarating time. And, I guess I now see that, my goal is one of balance. So I'm still a very aggressive saver and I'm still a very aggressive investor. But I don't want to wait until I'm, too old to enjoy my life before I enjoy my life. I want to have balance. And in that, I guess the richest man of Babylon, which is, one of the big savings Bibles, a tenth of you earn is yours to keep, does also talk about the importance of enjoying your life because it's a bit like going on a diet where you sort of say, well, you're only going to eat crackers and water for the rest of your life. I mean, what are you going to do? You want to go and, pig out on chocolate cake. You've got to sort of allow yourself a little bit of balance with that. So, I guess my view has changed a little bit. I don't want to be so much on a fire course that I'm waiting for that one day, that magical one day where I'm going to enjoy my life and, sit on a beach and finally have freedom. I want to be creating that in the now all the time.
Yeah, great answer, and I couldn't agree with you anymore. I think when I first realised financial independence was even a thing, I remember reading about it. I thought that's, I don't know anyone that does that, so that can't be a real thing. And then I started going to some forums, some property investing forums, and I was meeting people that were, 45, 50, that were living off their property, their income from their property earned them. So when I realised it was an actual thing, I dedicated so much of my time and energy into that. And at the very start, you can burn yourself out because I was, missing a lot of things because, every dollar mattered. Every dollar I spent felt like I was, every $50 I didn't put to investing was another day I had to work. It was a day that I didn't get to financial independence, and I did that for a couple of years. And then me and my partner, we joined finances last year, and she sort of balances me out because she's pretty frugal for a normal person, but then I'm on the absolute extreme side of things. So we balance each other out, and I think we strike a fine balance that we are enjoying our life, at the moment. And like I post, how much we spent last year. I think it was just over $50,000 for the whole year, which included everything, living costs, our eating costs, and we went on 2 holidays. Like it was excessive in my eyes, but for her it was quite a lean year. But I think half the fun is the challenge of getting there. Like you got to enjoy yourself getting there because and I read a lot of other, it's mainly US based bloggers, but, they say if you're not enjoying your life, a $1 extra in your bank account to make you technically it makes you financially independent is not going to improve your life. You need to be happy and then keep investing, keep saving, and then one day you'll become financially independent, but that won't change you. That, you're not going to wake up with a revelation one day being financially independent. You need to sort of build your life based on frugality, but live a happy and meaningful life and enjoy the journey. So when you get there, you're already in that state of mind, and then you just have the choice. Okay, maybe I like this job, maybe I don't like it so much anymore. I'm going to try my hand at something else now, and I don't have the stress and worry about paying off my mortgage or, paying grocery bills for my family, stuff like that.
I agree with you so much. I mean, I think, there's an underlying issue here about what is money and what is value. And if you're not using your money to live a life that's intentional for you and it's meaningfully full for you, it's just numbers in a bank. It doesn't mean anything. I mean, if you're, just leaving a sort of hedonistic, I don't care about tomorrow, I'm not thinking in a mindful way, just spending money left, right and centre, that's also not living an intentional life. That's not respecting yourself. It's not respecting your money. You're not thinking critically about what you're hoping to achieve or to live with. But, I think sometimes I had felt that in the frugal sphere there was, and this is probably a little bit controversial, but there tends to be a lot of stay-at-home mums who are frugal. And, I have nothing about people's life choices of deciding whether they work or whether they don't work. But I do wonder sometimes whether they're in controlling relationships, whether they have full power over their own money, whether they have the self-worth and the self-understanding to demand full power over their own money. And it's sort of almost this subtext of deprivation of, rather than thinking with abundance about what they can attract in their life, it's kind of like, I saved 5 cents today. So, Yeah,
I'm hearing what you're saying. There was someone posted a thread the other day about, you almost feel, like you're better than if you see someone spending a lot of money, like a new car, for example, like you see someone buy a new car. At one stage of my life, I fell into this category myself. You almost feel like superior, like, they just wasted so much money. They could have invested it. They're idiots sort of thing. But like, people, they spend their money how they want to spend their money, and it's all about balance. And, you do have to live your life. I think there is something to be said about, sacrifices now, that you're willing to make now so you can enjoy, a better life in the future. That's definitely true. But it's all about balance, right? With a lot of things in life, with most things, it's all about the balance.
I hear you. I wrote a blog post, I think in January this year or December. So I had this amazing meal last December. I had this 7-course seafood degustation with matching gins and local wines.
Wow.
An amazing meal. Unfortunately, that restaurant's now closed in Canberra, but it was just, let me just say, it was just, one of these memorable meals. And I felt almost guilty at the stage. It was like, how dare I do this because I'm a frugalista, know? Frugalistas don't go and have 7-course seafood stations,
Yeah.
We're miserable bunch. We make do on foraged weeds, which I do often eat. But then I thought about it and I thought, no, this isn't the true story of my life. And in this case, I was actually invited to that restaurant because I was invited to do a food review. So it was actually, I wasn't paying a cent at all. So, in a sense, it was, to be a bit crass, it was free food. So, it was, it was actually quite frugal, but that's obviously not why I was doing it. I was doing it because I wanted to find out about this restaurant and actually tell a story about it. And I'm quite passionate, particularly about promoting Canberra as a food destination. But, then I thought a bit more about it and I thought, well, if I'm a frugal person, why can't I enjoy my life? Why can't I save for that skiing holiday I always wanted to? Why can't I do the things that I always dreamed of? Like, why should I have to feel guilty about those things? I mean, it's a value judgment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some people as well, from the outside that don't quite know, what the FI crowd or the FI crowd is about and the frugal people for that matter, they, sometimes think that, these people, they're just, they're living off breadsticks and they don't turn the heater on ever, and they're just and they're saving every single dollar, and like they're gonna be retired when they're 40, but they haven't lived a good life. It's like, it's not about that, or it shouldn't be about that in my eyes. It's like you just live a sensible life, and there's just so much bullshit that you can cut out that cost a whole bunch of money that doesn't improve your life whatsoever. A whole bunch of commercialized crap in the world that's easy to cut out. and you can, half your bill straight away. And then there's the stuff that's really important to you that does cost money, and that's okay. If you have a budget and you're sticking to it, or you're being, good in other areas, splurge, buy that new dress, or, go to that fancy restaurant, do whatever it is that makes you happy. But just, it's all about balance, and make sure you're not being excessive, and you're putting the money away and being financially responsible.
Look, I hear you. There's so much clutter. There is so much clutter. And, people have these houses that are much bigger than they need, filled with stuff they never need. And they don't speak to their kids. They don't speak to their parents. It's all just clutter.
Do you know what? When I see those big houses these days, because we've only been living together, me and my partner, for over a year now, but I've only moved out of home 2 and a bit years ago. And before that, I was like, yeah, big house, like that's going to be awesome. I have like 10 cars, whatever, like, dreaming. And now all I think about is when I see these huge mansions is, how long would it take them to vacuum that house? Like, they better have a maid or something, because like I could not. I spend the Sunday vacuuming our house and it takes long enough, and it's a 2-bedroom unit. It's tiny. It's like, I don't think I ever want to own a big house. I want to own a nice house that's very, it has a lot of good technology in it, because I'm in IT, and I'm also in government, by the way, which is just a funny tidbit. But I like to have a lot of nice things and, all up to date with the tech, but the size of the house doesn't bother me, like, at all. I see these big houses and see, people mowing their lawn for their whole Sunday. And, some people like that, I guess, but it's not for me.
Well, I'm just going to put this out there. Maybe that's a limiting belief. And I know I've had a limiting belief for a long time too about, not being worthy of a big house or not wanting a big house. And that perhaps reflects my childhood too, where there was a lot of emphasis placed on those sorts of things. And I just acknowledge that's there. And, sometimes I need to say to the universe that I'm worthy. And should I choose to have a big house, it's okay.
Yeah.
That said, I've downsized to a 3-bedroom apartment in a Canberra, where I can now cycle to work, and I can now walk to local cafes and restaurants and walk to my kids' schools, and I've dramatically slashed my energy bills, and I'm very happy. I spend a lot less time on housework and a lot more time on writing, and has been a very meaningful change for me.
That's great. Now, we're speaking about restaurants and going out to eat and stuff.
Yes.
Do you want to chat to us about a little bit about the $50 a week challenge that you have going?
Thank you. Well, this week I actually celebrate 1 year of living on $50 a week, which is for food and groceries and toiletries. So this is for myself, my 2 children who are aged 5 and 7, who were with me probably about 80 to 90% of the time. And then, feeding other people who come and visit, and, that type of thing. Now, that probably sounds very restrictive, but, I started it a year ago because I knew I was going to move house at some point. I didn't have an exact date, but, I sort of had these vague plans of selling and moving, and I knew I had too much in my cupboards and my fridge. And I sort of went, look, really, let's just stop buying stuff and let's just try and, use up some of this. The weird thing is that a year later, I probably got just as much food in my fridge and in my freezer and in my cupboards. I dramatically managed to cut down the amount I throw out. But certainly none of us are starving, and it's really been quite an eye-opener, because I think sometimes when we shop, we buy things out of habit. We have these big trolleys, and so then you think you've got to fill them up with stuff. Mm-hmm. And so on average, Australians throw out 1 in 5 shopping bags full of food, and this isn't, like bad food. It's things that just never get opened. And, the ritual for most Australian families is every weekend you go through your fridge and you throw out stuff.
It's such a waste, isn't it?
Food. So once you sort of, I think, accept that you're not going to starve. I mean, I'm overweight. I think most people I know in Australia are overweight. We're probably not many of us are going to starve. You take that as a basic premise, and then sort of think how you can use what you've got creatively, and you accept free food from other people. And, I forage from time to time because I like to do that. I like to eat local and I like to forage. And you think of lower cost ways to make things. It's not as unachievable as you might think. That said, the proviso here is, I'm a 5 foot tall woman who perhaps doesn't exercise as much as she should, even though I've taken up cycling. I actually probably don't need to eat a lot, and I go out a lot, whether it's invited to food reviews or work events or social events or someone's house. You know, it just happens. And I think actually a lot of people in Australia are the same. You're probably out once or twice a week, and that's probably not factored into your food budget either. But I have young children who are picky eaters, particularly my eldest. They don't eat large amounts of food. If I had, say, 4 teenage children, I'd probably need a slightly different budget.
Yep.
But definitely it's achievable, and probably I mean, $50 is actually, there's a fair bit of slack there. I could probably do it on maybe $40 if I really tried.
Wow, that is unbelievable. $50.
So, you know, it is quite achievable. And I think a big thing too is cleaning products, because we spend a fortune on cleaning products, and it's often things we don't need anyway. So that's a big part of it too.
That's absolutely incredible. I know for me and my partner, the grocery bill is our second most expensive thing that we spend on. Last financial year, it's rent. It's always rent as the number one, and groceries is second. And I'm just trying to work out roughly in my head, per week we would roughly spend $150 for two people, $150 each week. And you're absolutely right with the amount of waste that Australian, not that I know about, you know, the rest of the world, but we chuck out so much stuff in Australia, definitely. And I used to work at Coles. I worked at Coles for 6 years when I was working part-time, and things would come in and it'd be like a tiny bit dented or damaged or whatever, like perfectly good food. And they'll be like, chuck it out. And I'll be, well, can I just eat it? I'll eat it. And they say, no, we can't let you eat it. Like if something happens to you, you get sick or something, you know, Coles, we would rather chuck something out than go through a legal battle if something was to happen to you, which I can, you know, sort of makes sense. But like really, there's just so much good food that just gets chucked into the bin every single night, probably all around the world.
Yes.
And you think about the stage that it took, especially, you know, meat and poultry and stuff like that. You know, they raise it, they feed it, it's water, everything that goes into making that product, for it only to be chucked down the drain. It's just, it's incredible, isn't it?
It is. I'm no longer vegetarian. I was for 10 years, some time ago. But I must say I still get very upset whenever meat is wasted. I mean, an animal has given up its life for us, for our nutrition. It's very sad when I have to throw out meat. I still feel sad about that.
Actually, my sister did a mini documentary, I guess you call it, I think it's got a special name, but it was about dumpster divers in Australia. And it was really interesting. It was people who, would go to dumpsters, and they had jobs and stuff. Like they weren't homeless. They were people that, you know, had money and everything, but some of them did it out of principle. Like that's pretty extreme, but, they just, to show that you can live a perfectly healthy life, without actually buying food. Now, I'm sure it's, you know, not something that most of us would do, but, I found it pretty interesting. It was a pretty good little, mini series, about the dumpster divers in Melbourne and stuff like that. So that was pretty cool.
Yeah, I have a friend who's a dumpster diver. She may have been inspired by that documentary. I'm not sure, but certainly it had a lot of comment in frugal circles.
I'm sure they might have,
readers on my blog about that phenomenon. And I had been aware of that too, because there had been, you know, some talk. I think Amy Decision from the Taiwan Gazette, which is a US publication, which is a bit older now, she's talked about dumpster diving as well. So there has been a move in that from the States. It's not something I do, mainly just because I'm a bit time pressed and I don't have much time away from my kids. I wouldn't take my children dumpster diving.
No.
Just because I think for young children it's probably not really that safe.
No, I wouldn't do it myself. Yeah. It's just interesting.
No, but I totally do agree very much with that principle of avoiding food waste. So, you know, if I was single and had lots of time, it's probably something I would do. What I do, however, is I'm a member of the Buy Nothing Project, which is a Facebook group. There's a number of groups throughout Australia, and people will regularly be moving house, or they'll just have things in their cupboards they don't want, and I always put up my hand. for those things. So in fact, last week I picked up half a container of grapeseed oil and 2/3 a bottle of lime juice cordial that I'll make lemon limes and bitters from, and I have absolutely no issues whatsoever from accepting free food or used food from people. I'd much rather do that than it go to waste. And most of my friends know that too. And so, if people are going on holidays and they've got leftovers, they'll give it to me. And I like to think that generosity comes from the heart. Often I'll, cook something with something and I'll take it to church, or I have a blogging friend up the road who's doing things quite tough. She has a sickness and she doesn't have a lot of money. So sometimes if I've got leftover food, I'll drop her off some soup or something. So I think the generosity does come round. And people, I accept with gratitude. I don't accept from a place of neediness. I accept with gratitude and I pass it on.
Sure. Now, so this the $50 a week challenge, is that something that readers can sign up to, or how does that work? You're running a challenge, aren't you, on your site?
That's right. I'm running a challenge in September to encourage people to do it, and the feedback has been fantastic. I'm really excited about it. So people can join by checking it out on my blog, which is Ms. Frugal Ears, www.msfrugalears.com.
I'll put a link in the show notes.
Thank you. Or else they can join the Facebook group, which is Frugal Dare to Millionaire, and participate in the conversation about how people are going with that.
No worries. Also, I'll put that in. Great. Now, if you could give one bit of advice to someone who wants to become a little bit more frugal, what's your number one go-to advice for someone green that's, not very frugal, or even if they are pretty frugal? What would you say to them?
This is a good question, because people often think you're like the magic talisman. Oh, I need you to fix my life.
Yeah. Really, I get that a bit as well.
Yeah, I can imagine. I think the number one piece of advice is to record your spending. I mean, there's lots of apps you can use on a phone these days, but even just having a really old-fashioned little diary in your handbag, or just keep it with you, and every time you spend money on a cup of coffee, or you spend money on lunch, or you spend money on something, you write it down, and after a month you look at the amount you spent, and it's really pretty clear then where the money's going. And then without having to have a big discussion about what's a want or a need, it really does, if you've got to write it down and track it, it will make you regulate whether something's important or not.
Do you know what? That is the exact advice I give people. That's my go-to advice that I give people as well. I say, just record your spendings, because even if you don't do anything about it, I promise you'll see something in there, record it, and you'll be like, what the? How do I spend that much money on that? What, like, are you serious? That's the best one. That's my number one go-to as well. What do you use to track your spending, just out of curiosity?
Yeah, good question. I used to, for a number of years, use a little diary that I kept in my handbag, and I was always very happy because a particular credit union that I was with at the time, they gave it to me for free every year, and I used to hang out for that. I think they used to cost $2 to buy an equivalent. But I now use an app called Good Budget. So it's like a pocketbook envelope kind of app, and it's not sophisticated. I think there's been a number of other new apps that have many more bells and whistles, but it's just easy. I can do it. Whatever
works for you.
Straight away, and I don't have to worry about it. At some point I need to upgrade to a more fancy one, but look, that just works. And so I try and use cash wherever possible too. So that really helps too. Because there's something about physical cash rather than just pay waving it on your card that just really reinforces the fact that you are spending money.
Yep. I use Get Pocketbook. Pocketbook's the app, but the website's getpocketbook.com, and I like it. It's funny that you say use cash, because I actually always use card, but the only reason I do that is because Pocketbook links into your bank. You can link into your bank and read all the transactions. So I try to do everything on the card so it can read it, whereas if I do it with cash, I have to figure out where I withdrew the cash. So if it was like Safeway, it will come up as groceries. It automatically categorizes the transactions, which is like a bit of the smarts in the software, and I have to sort of recategorize it to say whatever I spent that cash on. But whatever works for you, right? Like whatever works for you, just stick with that.
Yeah, exactly. But sometimes the harder you make it to spend money, the less likely you will to actually spend it.
Yeah, absolutely.
The easier it is, the faster it goes.
All right. We have reached the end of the podcast. How time has flown. If people are listening and want to get in contact with you, what's the best place to reach you?
The best place to reach me is via my blog, Miss Frugal Ears, or they can also find me on Facebook, also Ms. Frugal Ears, or on Instagram as Ms. Frugal Ears.
All of those will be in the show notes for the audience convenience. So if you enjoyed these podcasts, guys, and want me to make more, make sure you drop me a comment and ratings on iTunes. Just search Aussie Firebug on iTunes and you'll find me. I'm also on SoundCloud at www.soundcloud.com/Aussie-Firebug. Show notes of this episode and a transcript will be found on my website. Thank you so much, Miss Frugal Ears. It's been an absolute pleasure. Hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.
Oh, most certainly. I'm so glad to hear that I've met someone who's on a very similar page.
Great. All right. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, guys, for listening to another episode of the Aussie Firebug podcast. For links to all of the resources plus an entire transcript of this episode, head over to aussiefirebug.com. Make sure you never miss out on another episode by subscribing now on iTunes or SoundCloud.